Welcome to Hollywood Graveyard. The love of horror is part of what initially drove me to the cemeteries years ago. Perhaps it was the same for you. So today, just in time for Halloween, we're going to take a journey across time and through the cemeteries of the world to visit the graves of some of your favorite icons of horror. Join us, if you dare. Many of our favorite horror franchises began as stories written by storytellers of centuries past. Let's begin there, with the origins of timeless horror stories and the writers who brought them to life. The rise of Romanticism in the late 1700s, early 1800s led to a renewed interest in folklore. Two German brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, known as the Brothers Grimm, set out to collect and publish some of history's best-known folk tales, like Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White. Their first collection of folk tales was published in 1812.
Grimm's Fairy Tales. What a lovely name, Grimm.
But these were not the Disney versions of these stories. No, the Grimm fairy tales were much darker, often written as warning tales for children. In Cinderella, one of the stepsisters cuts off her toes to fit into the slipper. In Little Red Riding Hood, Red is eaten by the wolf, but later cut out of its stomach and saved by the huntsman. And in Hansel and Gretel, a cannibalistic witch attempts to eat two children, but is herself killed when Gretel pushes her into her own oven. Folktales like these set the stage for horror stories to come in the next century. The Brothers Grimm rest here at Alter Sankt Matthäus Kirchhof in Berlin, Germany. Just a few years later, a young woman named Mary Shelley was writing what would become one of the most iconic stories and characters in the history of Gothic horror. In 1816, Mary traveled to the Lake Geneva area in Switzerland to spend the summer with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. Confined to the lakeside house under an incessant rain, the company amused themselves with ghost stories, which prompted Byron to propose they each write a ghost story. Mary began writing what would become her novel, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, first published in 1818. Frankenstein and his monster have cemented themselves in popular consciousness, adapted in literature, on stage, and of course, film countless times. Mary rests here in St. Peter's Churchyard in England. Buried with her is a fragment of her husband Percy Shelley's heart, which she kept as a memento mori after his death. If you're a Halloween lover, there's a pretty good chance you've traveled to New York to visit Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Am I right? It's one of my favorite cemeteries in the world, particularly around October. There's a special magic in the air here around that time, and if you're lucky, you might just stumble onto the Headless Horseman strolling among the tombstones. That's because in these grounds is the man who told the story of this quiet town. This is the grave of Washington Irving. In 1820, he published The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the story of Ichabod Crane, who runs afoul of the Headless Horseman. The story would be adapted on screen by filmmakers from Disney to Tim Burton, and remains a staple of Halloween folklore. Those who know me know I'm a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. We did a short film about him in 2022, The Graves of Edgar Allan Poe and the Women Who Haunted Him.
This is nothing but dreaming. A dream within a dream. Or a nightmare.
Edgar Allan Poe's name alone conjures up images of ravens, beating hearts, disturbed graves, undead women, and bereaved lovers. A key figure of dark romanticism, Poe was the American godfather of Gothic horror, mystery, and the macabre, remembered for poems like Annabel Lee, and his greatest critical success during his lifetime, The Raven, which made him something of a rock star of his day.
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
There were also short stories like The Telltale Heart and The Pit and the Pendulum. But Poe is also considered the father of the modern detective story. His fictional Inspector C. Auguste Dupin, a predecessor of the likes of Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. Tales like The Murders in the Rue Morgue thrilled Victorian audiences through Poe's genius use of ratiocination. But perhaps the greatest mystery America's first mystery writer left us was the mystery surrounding his own death. On October 3, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found on the streets of Baltimore outside a tavern, delirious and in great distress. He had left Richmond a week earlier for New York, but somehow ended up on the streets of Baltimore, half frozen and out of his mind. There are no surviving accounts of what happened during that ensuing week, and Poe never regained enough lucidity to explain his condition. He was taken to the hospital in a stupor and died days later on October 7, 1849. Edgar Allan Poe was 40. His death certificate has been lost and no cause of death has ever been determined, leading to wide speculation ranging from brain disease to alcoholism, even murder. Despite being one of the most well-known writers of his day, Poe died in poverty. He was buried in a simple mahogany coffin near this spot in the Westminster Burial Grounds here in Baltimore, close to his grandfather David Poe and brother Henry. But this was not the end of Edgar Allan Poe's journey. Decades later, in the 1870s, a local school teacher and students raised funds to have a permanent monument to Poe created. In the fall of 1875, Edgar Allan Poe was exhumed, risen from the grave like so many of his characters. To properly identify him, the coffin was opened, one witness noting, "The skull was in excellent condition. The shape of the forehead, one of Poe's striking features, was easily discerned." Poe was removed from his original burial place behind Westminster Hall to be relocated to a place of prominence and honor in the graveyard, close to the front gate. As the coffin was being moved, pieces of it broke off and were quickly snatched up by admirers who were present for the event. Edgar Allan Poe's journey ended here, and this new tomb, Poe's final resting place, was dedicated on November 17, 1875. He now rests here alongside his beloved wife, Virginia, a key inspiration in his writings. Another iconic character from the 19th century would come from the mind of Bram Stoker, which brings us to the columbarium at Golders Green in London. This is the urn of Bram Stoker. In 1897, he published the novel Dracula, which established the modern legend of the fictional vampire. It's the story of a Transylvanian nobleman, Count Dracula, who moves to England and plagues a seaside town as a vampire. The narrative is written through a series of letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. It has since become a seminal piece of Gothic fiction and was the source material for some of your favorite movies. Moving into the early 20th century and Swan Point Cemetery in Rhode Island, we find a noted author of the weird, of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, H.P. Lovecraft. As a writer, Lovecraft remained relatively unknown during his life, publishing mainly in pulp magazines, but is now regarded as one of the most significant writers of horror and weird fiction of the 20th century. He's best known today for his Cthulhu mythos, with tales including The Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness. Lovecraft was never able to make a comfortable living from his writing and died of cancer at the age of 46. After his death, those with whom Lovecraft had corresponded continued to expand upon his mythos, and the popularity of Lovecraft grew, becoming a major influence on modern writers of horror and science fiction. His work has also inspired countless adaptations in film, television, games, and music. When moving pictures came along in the late 1800s, horror was a favorite genre for the very first filmmakers, like movie magician Georges Méliès, resting here at Père Lachaise in Paris. He got his start performing as a magician on stage. When moving pictures came about in the late 1800s, Méliès took the skills he had honed on stage and translated them to film. He became known for his trick films, developing special effects commonplace today, but that astounded audiences of that time. Making things disappear or reappear, disembodied heads, multiple exposures, time-lapse, substitution splices, it was all magic on the screen. These effects came in particularly handy for fantasy and horror. His 1896 film, The Haunted Castle, or The House of the Devil, is widely believed to be the first horror movie. Flying bats, dancing skeletons, ghosts, witches, and goblins, and the devil himself all make an appearance and disappearance. it wouldn't be long until our favorite horror stories written by the authors we featured earlier would be made into silent films. We often picture Boris Karloff when we think of Frankenstein, but decades before his appearance as the monster, a character actor named Charles Ogle would be the very first to portray the monster on screen in the 1910 silent short film Frankenstein. As you can see, the interpretation of the monster is starkly different from what we're used to seeing today. Charles Ogle rests here at Forest Lawn Glendale in the Sunrise Slope section. Nearby is the Great Mausoleum. Here in these quiet Gothic halls we find the niche of Theda Bara, Hollywood's original vamp, short for vampire, a term coined for her role in the 1915 film A Fool There Was. Her carefully crafted image was that of the dark and exotic temptress, the femme fatale, gothic, dangerous, and sinfully alluring, with her scandalous and revealing pre-code outfits and horror-themed promotional materials. Her films include Cleopatra and The She-Devil. Tragically though, we may never have a chance to see them. Most of her films were lost in the 1937 Fox Vault fire. This footage you see here is all that is believed to remain of Cleopatra, made more than a century ago. John Barrymore was known as the Great Profile, a legend of the stage and screen and one of the most idolized actors of his day. He's known for Shakespearean roles like Hamlet, but took his talents to one of the great early silent horror films as well, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1920. Barrymore's performance as both Jekyll and Hyde was transformative, literally. The early part of Jekyll's transformation was achieved with no makeup or effect, but through Barrymore's ability to contort his own face and body. Critics of the era cautioned audiences that Barrymore's Hyde was the most ghastly thing seen in film, even cautioning audiences against potential mental and physical distress at the sight of the ghoulish character. After his death, Barrymore was initially entombed here in the mausoleum at Calvary in East LA. Decades later, his son had his body removed and reinterred in the family plot in Philadelphia. German Expressionism had a major influence on horror in both the silent and early sound eras, an influence that still resonates to this day. German Expressionism dealt with emotions and events in a more subjective or abstract manner in order to unsettle the audience. Two films of this early silent era epitomize this. The first is considered one of the greatest horror films ever made. 1920's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, in which a hypnotist uses a brainwashed somnambulist to commit murder. That unwitting sleepwalker was played by legendary German actor Conrad Veidt. Several years later, Conrad would play the tragic Gwynplaine, whose face is disfigured with a horrific rictus grin in The Man Who Laughs, a look that would inspire the Joker. After his death in 1943, Conrad was cremated in New York and initially laid to rest in the Ferncliff Mausoleum, the same mausoleum where Judy Garland was originally entombed. In 1998, on the 55th anniversary of his death, Conrad Veidt's ashes were relocated here to the Golders Green Columbarium in London, where he lived after fleeing Germany at the rise of the Nazi Party. The second German film, whose influence would reverberate through the generations, was actually a thinly veiled, unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. You know this one, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, released in 1922. We had the incredible privilege of being able to travel to Germany and Slovakia last year to visit not only the graves of 3 of the talents behind the film, but also many of the original filming locations, which look as amazing today as they did a century ago. It was like stepping right into the film. We presented the graves and filming locations on our channel in the form of a silent short narrative film, The Tomb of Nosferatu, in which me and my co-star set out to visit and film these sites, but in doing so unleash a dark shadow from cinema's past. The first grave we visited was the film's protagonist, resting here at Friedrichsfeld Central Cemetery in Berlin. You may not know his name, but if you've seen the film, you'll recognize him. This is the grave of Gustav von Wangenheim, who played Hutter in the film, the Harker character from the original story. He is the man who must save his beloved from the clutches of the vampire. The next grave we visited was the film's director, one of the pioneers of horror in cinema, F.W. Murnau, whose magnificent tomb is found in the equally magnificent Südwest Kirchhof-Stansdorf cemetery outside of Berlin. The tomb features a bust of Murnau on the facade. It was his creative vision that made Nosferatu the masterpiece that endures more than a century later. He died tragically young, at 42, in a car crash in Southern California. If you head around back, you'll find a stairway down to his actual tomb, a fairly unusual sight. But like something straight out of a horror movie, in 2015, thieves broke into Murnau's tomb. The groundskeeper discovered it the next morning. He also found that Murnau's coffin had been pried open, and most disturbingly, the head of F.W. Murnau was gone. It had been stolen. To date, the skull has yet to be recovered. The last grave we visited here was of the vampire himself, or at least the man who so adeptly embodied the vampire Count Orlok in the film, Max Schreck. His grave can be found here in this woodland cemetery, Wilmersdorfer Waldfriedhof, Gutrefeld, not far from Murnau. He gave a terrifying performance as the vampire, much of that performance, it being a silent film, in the nuances of body language, movement, and facial expression. He was suited to play the role in more ways than one, perhaps even meant to. His last name, Schreck, means fright in German. Even his gravestone, tall and thin, reminded us of his character, Orlok. The original marker that was here was lost, so this new one was placed in 2011. As we were filming at Schreck's grave, we were accosted by hundreds of mosquitoes, getting our own blood sucked by tiny little vampires. It was annoying, yet strangely fitting. Here in Hollywood, the master of character acting in silent film, particularly in horror, was the legendary Lon Chaney. Let's step back into the great mausoleum at Forest Lawn Glendale to find him. Here in the Sanctuary of Meditation is the unmarked crypt of Lon Chaney. It remains unmarked at his family's request. He was known as the Man of 1,000 Faces for his ability to disappear into his characters. He also did all his own makeup to create his characters. Several of the silent era's most notable horror films starred Lon Chaney. He played Quasimodo in 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Then in 1925, he terrified audiences as the Phantom of the Opera. The unmasking scene with Mary Philbin is one of the most iconic in the history of cinema, and was so shocking it caused many in the audience to scream out and even faint. Chaney also starred in and created the look of the villain in London After Midnight, a film which sadly is believed to be lost. You film and history buffs likely know that Lon Chaney's son, Lon Chaney Jr., took on the mantle of movie monster following in his father's footsteps. In the universal world of horror, he would play the Wolfman, first in 1941 and in its various crossovers. He would also play Dracula, the Mummy, and Frankenstein's monster in various films. Jr. has no grave we can visit, as his body was donated to medical science after his death. Lon Chaney's leading lady in Phantom of the Opera can be found here in the same mausoleum where John Barrymore once rested, at Calvary Cemetery. This is the crypt of Mary Philbin, one of the silent era's scream queens. She played Christine in the Phantom of the Opera, unmasking the Phantom in that scene we saw earlier. She also played Dea in The Man Who Laughs in 1928 alongside Conrad Veidt. Horror in the early sound era was largely driven by two men, a father and son, Universal Pictures founder Carl Laemmle and his son Carl Laemmle Jr. In the early 30s, when sound was brand new, many studios were focusing on musicals or other narratives to highlight sound. But at Universal, they were making monsters. We're at Home of Peace Cemetery in East LA and the Chapel Mausoleum. During the silent era, it was Carl Laemmle Sr. who produced The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera at Universal. In the late 20s, Carl Sr. made Carl Jr., entombed here above him, head of production. And it was Jr. who would spearhead the studio's move into horror films in the early 30s, which would become a major part of Universal's legacy today. Among the classic films he produced are Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein. Hollywood's first horror star of the sound era has become an indelible icon of the genre, his performance defining what we think of today when we hear the name Dracula. This is Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. In the star-studded grotto area we find the final resting place of Bela Lugosi. The Hungarian actor was perfect for the role, having played Dracula on the Broadway stage, though he wasn't Universal's first choice. His performance has become iconic, being both menacing and alluring at once.
I am Dracula. Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Lugosi would go on to appear in other classic horrors like The Black Cat, The Raven, and Son of Frankenstein. His final on-screen appearance was in Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space. After his death, Bela Lugosi was buried here in his Dracula cape. Lugosi's leading lady in Dracula, the object of the vampire's desires, was a talented, bright-eyed actress named Helen Chandler. She played Mina, Dracula's intended victim, in the 1931 film, the role she's best known for today.
Then I saw 2 red eyes staring at me, and a white, livid face came down out of the mist. It came closer and closer. I felt its breath on my face, and then its lips.
After her death in 1965 at just 57, Helen was cremated at Chapel of the Pines in Los Angeles, and her ashes placed down in the vault, which is inaccessible to the general public. There is a common misconception that her ashes were unclaimed or abandoned, but such is not actually the case. Her brother, having lost his only sister, made the painful decision to have her ashes placed in vaultage after she was cremated here. It was not an uncommon practice at that time, particularly when money was scarce, for ashes that were not scattered or privately held to be placed in the Chapel of the Pines vault. In 2023, I teamed up with Jessica Wall of the blog Silence is Platinum to catalog the urns here in vaultage, which span more than a century and well in excess of 10,000 simple copper box urns, some placed here intentionally, some in fact unclaimed. There are numerous Hollywood stars in these 5 community vaults, and the very first I sought out down here, being a Dracula fan, was Helen Chandler. We headed to Vault 5, which corresponded to the time frame of her death. I was thrilled and overwhelmed when I spotted her urn high on the left wall. You can see it here in the middle of the shelf. And after locating her urn, we reached out to her next of kin, some great-nephews and nieces, to ask their permission to have Helen's urn retrieved from vaultage and placed in a public niche at Hollywood Forever, where she could finally be visited by fans who still love and remember her all these years later. To our delight, they agreed that Helen might want to be in a place where she could be visited, and they gave their permission and blessing. So, after 58 years, Helen's urn was retrieved from Vault 5.
Helen, we found you a new home.
And that new home is Hollywood Forever Cemetery, where she arrived in style in a vintage Rolls-Royce hearse. With the help of generous donations from you, the fans, we raised funds to give Helen a beautiful new resting place where she can be visited by those who still love and remember her. Helen's new urn and new niche can be found here at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in the Cathedral Mausoleum just down the hall from other Hollywood legends like Rudolph Valentino and Peter Lorre. So, if you're looking for a special Halloween outing this year, come say hello to Helen Chandler, bright-eyed star of Dracula and darling of the New York stage for the first time in more than a half-century. For the full story of Helen Chandler and her neighbor here at Hollywood Forever, Edmund Gwen, and Chapel of the Pines, be sure to check out our video, Opening the Vault, the story of Chapel of the Pines. A familiar face in the early Universal horrors, including Dracula, was a character actor named Dwight Frye. He's known for playing the neurotic sidekicks to the main villains. Dwight played Renfield in Dracula,
Monster, we're here.
Fritz in Frankenstein, and Carl in Bride of Frankenstein.
What we need is a female victim of sudden death. Can you do it?
You promised me 1,000 crowns.
Dwight Frye was just 44 when he died from a heart attack while traveling by bus in Hollywood. He's buried here in the Graceland section of Forest Lawn, Glendale. The filmmaker who helmed Universal's first sound horror rests here in the mausoleum at Angelus Rosedale in Los Angeles. This is the niche of Tod Browning. Tod was the director of 1931's Dracula, imbuing his own unique vision into the production, and setting the stage for the Universal horror universe of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Years earlier, in 1927, he had directed another classic horror, London After Midnight, starring Lon Chaney. The last known copy of the film was destroyed in the 1965 MGM Vault fire, making it one of the most sought-after lost silent films. Another of Browning's notable films of the era is the 1932 cult classic Freaks, which shocked and scandalized audiences. Tod Browning was once described as the Edgar Allan Poe of cinema. While Tod Browning directed Universal's first sound horror, another man would have an outsized influence on the horror universe in these early years, and we find that man here in the Sanctuary of Memory of the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn, Glendale. This is the niche of James Whale. Beginning with Frankenstein in 1931, James would direct 4 Universal horror films. After Frankenstein came The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein, his style showing influences of German Expressionism. All of these films are considered classics in the genre, and James Whale would be an influence on horror filmmakers for generations. Sadly, James Whale died by suicide, drowning himself in his pool at age 67. The man that James Whale would hire to portray Frankenstein's monster is a man whose face has become indelibly linked in the public consciousness to the monster, British actor Boris Karloff. He first played the monster in 1931's Frankenstein and would reprise the role for Bride of Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein. Frankenstein ranks among the greatest horror films of all time, owed in no small part to the humanity and pathos that Karloff was able to imbue into the monster.
It understands this time. It's wonderful.
Frankenstein, Frankenstein, where is it? Where is it?
Ah! Quiet, you fool!
Like Lugosi, Karloff would become a staple in the horror universe of this era, playing not only Frankenstein's monster, but also the Mummy. He'd also star in films like The Black Cat, The Ghoul, The Old Dark House, The Raven, and more. Boris Karloff even lent his voice to The Grinch. After his death at age 81, Boris Karloff was cremated here at the Guildford Crematorium in Surrey, England. To find the man who played the namesake, we head back to Chapel of the Pines in Los Angeles. Here in the Garden of Memories, in the memorial wall, we find a monument to Colin Clive. He played Dr. Frankenstein, the creator of the monster, in Frankenstein and the 1935 sequel Bride of Frankenstein.
It's alive! In the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
Clive was just 37 when he died from complications of alcoholism and tuberculosis in 1937. He was cremated here at Chapel of the Pines, his ashes scattered at sea, so this monument is a cenotaph. To find the leading lady in 1931's Frankenstein, we head to Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood. Here lies Mae Clarke. The actress, known for roles in films like The Public Enemy alongside James Cagney, played Henry Frankenstein's bride, Elizabeth, who is pursued by the monster. With the success of Frankenstein, Universal began work on a sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, which was released in 1935. As mentioned, several stars from the original reprised their roles, but we were introduced to some new ones as well. At London's Brompton Cemetery is the grave of Ernest Thesiger. He played the film's antagonist, Dr. Pretorius, in the sequel, delivering one of the most memorable lines in the movie.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
The bride was played by English actress Elsa Lanchester, whose character has become just as iconic as Karloff's monster. one of the Mount Rushmore of classic horror, if you will.
The Bride of Frankenstein.
She also played Mary Shelley in the film. Sadly, Elsa has no grave we can visit as she was cremated, her ashes scattered at sea. If your affinity for horror extends to special effects and prosthetics, then you likely know this next man, or at least know his work. In the world of the Universal monsters, there was one name who loomed large and brought many of these creatures to life, giving them the distinctive looks we recognize today. Meet Jack Pierce, the head of Universal's makeup department for more than 20 years, beginning in the late 20s. He created Conrad Veidt's Rictus Grin in The Man Who Laughs, Lugosi's Dracula, Karloff's Monster in Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Wolfman, The Bride, and many more. Jack's work remains some of the most recognizable in the history of horror cinema. He rests here at Forest Lawn, Glendale. We've covered Dracula, Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Mummy, Bride of Frankenstein. Who are we forgetting from this era? He may be hard to see, but he's unforgettable. He's the Invisible Man, played by four-time Oscar-nominated actor Claude Rains. The 1933 Universal picture was based on H.G. Wells' novel of the same name. Rains played Dr. Jack Griffin, who has gained invisibility through a series of secret experiments.
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? All right, I'll show you. I'll show you who I am and what I am. How do you like that, eh?
Claude Rains rests at Red Hill Cemetery in New Hampshire. And look, someone left a little invisible man here on his grave. Back at Hollywood Forever Cemetery near the lake, we find the grave of Fay Wray. She was Hollywood's original Scream Queen, literally. In the very early days of sound film, she was noted for having a particularly distinctive and chilling scream. You heard that spine-tingling scream in horror films like Dr. X, Mystery of the Wax Museum, The Most Dangerous Game, and perhaps most notably, in one of the early sound era's most iconic monster movies, King Kong in 1933. Fay lived to be 96. In the Courts of Remembrance at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills is the crypt of Charles Laughton. The British actor was a giant of the stage and screen, known for films like Mutiny on the Bounty, Spartacus, and The Private Life of Henry VIII, which won him an Oscar. He also made his mark on horror and monster movies of the 30s. His is one of the most recognized interpretations of Quasimodo in 1939's The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Why was I not made of stone like thee?
He also played Sir William Porterhouse in the Universal horror The Old Dark House. And you'll be curious to know that Charles was married to the actress who played the Bride of Frankenstein, Elsa Lanchester. Other actors would take up the mantle to play cinema's iconic monsters as well. Glenn Strange is perfectly named for an actor who played monsters in this era. He played Frankenstein's monster in 3 Universal films in the 40s, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Other horror films of the era include The Mad Monster, The Monster Maker, and The Black Raven. Glenn Strange rests here at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills. Doubling back once again to Hollywood Forever Cemetery and the Cathedral Mausoleum. I'm sure many of you know who we're back here to find. This is the niche of Peter Lorre. He burst onto the scene with his terrifying performance playing a child murderer in the 1931 German film M. This caught the eye of Hollywood, where he'd appear in films like The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca. But with his distinctive looks and voice, he shone in roles as villains and psychopaths in horrors like Mad Love and The Boogeyman Will Get You.
He shall be shut up when it's I who am mad. But nobody knows that.
Yes. Each man kills the thing he loves.
In the 60s, Laurie would team up with other horror legends like Roger Corman, Vincent Price, and Boris Karloff in films like Tales of Terror, The Raven, and The Comedy of Terrors.
I don't think he's quite dead enough yet to bury him.
You don't think he's quite dead enough yet?
Laurie's looks and voice would often be caricatured, including the maggot in Corpse Bride. And what of Peter's frequent co-star, one of the greatest legends of horror and a personal hero of mine, Vincent Price? Well, sadly, like a few we've already mentioned today, Vincent has no grave, his ashes scattered over Point Doom in Southern California. Vincent starred in many of Roger Corman's horror films of the 60s, including his Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, as well as in William Castle productions, like House on Haunted Hill.
I'm Vincent Price, and you're invited to my party in the House on Haunted Hill, where so far the ghosts have murdered only 7 people. So won't you come and make it 8?
His final on-screen role was in one of my favorite films of all time, Edward Scissorhands in 1990, in which he played the inventor.
When asked, will they tear, he replied, here and there, but they keep such a beautiful shape.
You also heard his distinctive voice at the end of Michael Jackson's Thriller. Vincent passed away in 1993 at age 82, his ashes scattered in the ocean near Malibu. We've arrived at the mid-20th century. James Arness is best known for his role as Marshal Matt Dillon for 20 years in the series Gunsmoke. But before that, the tall actor had memorable roles in horror and monster movies. He played The Thing in 1951's The Thing from Another World, and in 1954 starred in the classic monster movie Them. James Arness is entombed here in the Jasmine Terrace of the Great Mausoleum in Glendale. Heading back to Universal, there's one more monster that makes up the Mount Rushmore of classic Universal monsters, and he's celebrating his 70th birthday this year. You know who he is. He's called Creech, he's called Gillman, but to the layperson, he's the creature from the Black Lagoon. The star of Creature from the Black Lagoon was an actor familiar to fans of sci-fi and B-movies of the 50s. To find him, we head to Los Angeles National Cemetery, a veterans cemetery. Here lies Richard Carlson. He played Dr. David Reed in Creature from the Black Lagoon, a research scientist who battles but also values the life of the creature.
We didn't come here to fight with monsters. We're not equipped for it.
David!
No.
You also saw Richard in films like The Ghost Breakers and It Came from Outer Space. Richard's co-star in The Black Lagoon, the film's leading lady, and the object of the creature's fascination, is Julie Adams, credited early in her career as Julia Adams. Julie played Kay Lawrence, who didn't just come along to be the lead character's love interest. Kay was a research scientist who contributed to the expedition with her understanding of lungfish. But her beauty was undeniable, and she caught the eye of the Gillman, becoming the object of its fascination, perhaps even desire, the creature stopping at nothing to get to her.
Hey, what was it like down there?
Like another world.
I'd like to see it.
The renowned actress of film, television, and stage, whose beauty was only exceeded by her kindness, lived to be 92 and rests here at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Arkansas. And as 2024 marks the 70th anniversary of Creature from the Black Lagoon, I'm excited to share with you a sneak peek at our next big film project coming later this year. We're back at Chapel of the Pines in Los Angeles. Resting in Vault 2 is the simple copper box urn of Kurt Neumann. He was a German-American director known for science fiction horror films of the 50s. Perhaps his best-known work is the original version of The Fly in 1958.
You'll be all right now. I know it's working!
But Kurt would never know the success of The Fly, passing away suddenly at age 50 just 1 week before the film's release. Other notable films include Kronos and She-Devil. Another notable sci-fi horror film of the era was The Blob. It starred Steve McQueen in his first leading role, and his co-star, Anita Corso, who rests here at Valhalla Memorial Park. Anita played Jane in The Blob, who along with Steve spots a meteorite that crashes to Earth, carrying with it an amoeboid alien monster that devours living beings, growing larger and more aggressive throughout the film.
How do you get people to protect themselves from something they don't believe in?
Well, you keep trying and hoping you can find some sort of proof that'll convince them.
At Eternal Valley Cemetery in Santa Clarita, we find the grave of Tor Johnson. The hulking character actor's large build and distinctive looks made him perfect in the roles of villains and ghouls in low-budget films of the 50s and 60s. He played Lobo in the films Bride of the Monster and Night of the Ghouls, and Inspector Clay in Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Stop him, Theda! He's close enough! Turn off your electrode gun! No! No! Stop him!
And you'll be curious to know that a mask based on Tor Johnson was the best-selling Halloween mask in the 60s and 70s. Back at Forest Lawn Glendale in the Garden of Ascension, we find William Castle, a legend in the world of B-movies, low-budget horror, and psychological thrillers. Among the classics he directed and produced are Macabre, 13 Ghosts, Mr. Sardonicus, and House on Haunted Hill. Castle was famous for using gimmicks when promoting and showcasing his films. These included offering audiences a certificate for a $1,000 insurance policy in case they die of fright while watching Macabre, and a money-back guarantee for those too frightened to see the finale of Homicidal.
When you go to see my picture Homicidal, you'll get one of these certificates. Then at the climax of Homicidal, there will be a fright break. If you are too frightened to stay to see the rest of the picture, you can present this certificate at the Coward's Corner and get your full admission price refunded.
The success of 50s B-movies, including those of William Castle, inspired Alfred Hitchcock to make one of horror's greatest films, the 1960 classic Psycho. At Westwood Village Memorial Park, we find the movie's leading lady and Norman Bates's victim, Janet Leigh. She played Marion Crane in the film. Hers is the infamous shower scene, one of the most iconic scenes in the history of horror. Janet would be nominated for a Best Supporting Actress Oscar for her performance. She is the mother of another horror icon, Jamie Lee Curtis, of Halloween fame. The man who wrote the book Psycho was based upon is also here at Westwood, in the Room of Prayer. This is the niche of Robert Bloch. He published Psycho in 1959 and would follow up with sequels Psycho 2 and Psycho House. Other notable works include The Hellbound Train and American Gothic. One of the most iconic characters in Psycho is not seen, but heard. From those screeching violins to the lyrical but haunting main theme, the music of Psycho has set the standard for horror film scoring and has often been imitated. The music was composed by the legendary Bernard Herrmann. He was a favorite of Hitchcock, also scoring films like Vertigo. You also heard his music in shows like The Twilight Zone. Bernard Herrmann ranks among the greatest film composers of all time and rests here at Beth David Cemetery in New York. On the subject of horror composers, let's visit another of Hollywood's most legendary maestros of the macabre, here at Hillside in Culver City, Jerry Goldsmith. He won an Oscar for his score for the 1976 film The Omen. This would be the second year in a row that a horror film score won the Oscar, after John Williams' Jaws won the year before. Goldsmith also wrote chilling scores for other films like Poltergeist and The Haunting, and provided music for a number of episodes of The Twilight Zone and Thriller as well. The 1960s also gave us a new kind of zombie movie. Let's head up to Canada, to the Toronto necropolis, to find the grave of George A. Romero. He's a man whose name has become synonymous with zombie pictures because he helped redefine them in 1968 with the release of his film Night of the Living Dead. The film reimagined zombies not as persons enslaved by voodoo magic, but as reanimated corpses hungering for the flesh of the living. The film garnered a cult following and would spawn 5 sequels. Outside of the Dead series, Romero is known for films like Monkey Shines and Creepshow. Night of the Living Dead was also pioneering in its reflection of social and cultural changes in the US during the 60s. Romero cast Duane Jones, a black man, in the lead role. This was the first horror film to star a black actor since 1940's Son of Ingagi, which had an all-black cast. Duane played Ben in Night of the Living Dead, the level-headed leader of a group of individuals trapped in a farmhouse menaced by the living dead.
Look, I know you're afraid. I'm afraid too. But we have to try to board the house up together. Now, I'm going to board up the windows and the doors. Do you understand? We'll be all right here.
Duane Jones rests here at Westview Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia. Another iconic horror film was released in 1968, Rosemary's Baby. The film stars Mia Farrow and John Cassavetes, who rests here at Westwood Village Memorial Park. He plays Guy Woodhouse, Rosemary's husband and one of the film's antagonists. Rosemary's Baby is considered one of the greatest horror films of all time.
Those are Esbats or Sabbats or whatever they're called.
Don't get excited, huh?
Read what they do, Guy. They use blood in their rituals, and the blood that has the most power is baby's blood. And they don't just use the blood, they use the flesh, too.
Rosemary, for God's sakes.
Cassavetes was also known as a pioneer of independent filmmaking. One of the most celebrated authors of the 20th century also rests here at Westwood Village Memorial Park, Ray Bradbury. He's best known for his dystopian novel Fahrenheit 451, alluded to here on his stone. But he also produced numerous memorable horror stories throughout his career, many of which would be adapted on screen. These include Something Wicked This Way Comes and the anthology of short stories The October Country. He's also remembered for his beloved 1972 Halloween novel, The Halloween Tree, which would also be made into a film. Next up is Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Silver Spring, Maryland. Here's one for you fans of The Exorcist. This is the crypt of William Blatty. The Exorcist is considered another of the greatest horror films ever made, and it wouldn't have been made if William Blatty hadn't written the novel first. He wrote the novel, The Exorcist, in 1971, and then 2 years later wrote the screenplay for the iconic film. Blatty won the Oscar for Best Screenplay, a rare Oscar win in the horror genre.
The one hope, the only hope, The Exorcist.
He would go on to write and direct The Exorcist 3, as well as write and direct the 9th configuration. William died from multiple myeloma at the age of 89. In 1974, Frankenstein got the Mel Brooks treatment in the hilarious parody Young Frankenstein. It stars Gene Wilder as Dr. Frankenstein, and Marty Feldman as his hunchbacked sidekick, Igor.
No, it's pronounced Igor.
Marty suffered from thyroid disease and developed Graves' ophthalmopathy, which caused his eyes to bulge and be misaligned, giving him a distinctive look that he used to great comedic effect.
I ain't got nobody, and nobody cares for me. Igor, Frederick.
He won a Saturn Award for his performance as Igor. Marty was just 48 when he died from a heart attack while filming the movie Yellowbeard. Marty rests here at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills. There seems to be some debate as to whether or not 1975's Jaws is a horror movie, it more commonly being categorized as a high-seas adventure thriller. But with jump scares, suspense, a monster, and gore, it certainly has all the hallmarks of a horror film. At Oakdale Cemetery in North Carolina, we find the grave of Murray Hamilton. He played Larry Vaughn, mayor of Amity, in Jaws and its sequel, Jaws 2.
You're either gonna kill this animal or you're gonna cut off its food supply.
Larry, we have to close the beaches.
Brody, sick vandalism. That is a deliberate mutilation of a public service message.
And look, Jaws even came to pay Murray a visit here at his grave. Earlier in his career, you saw Murray on episodes of Night Gallery and Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and he played Mr. Death on The Twilight Zone.
Because as of 3 o'clock this hot July afternoon, he'll be stalked by Mr. Death.
When television began to land in living rooms across the world, it wasn't long before spooky stories and characters would be broadcast through the airwaves. And television's first horror host was a Hollywood legend who rests here at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, Mila Nurmi, better known as Vampira. She created the campy character Vampira in the 50s, hosting her own TV series, The Vampira Show, from 1954 to 1955. The show would broadcast vintage horror films presented by Vampira.
It says that she is a gaunt, black-haired glamour ghoul who comes out through ominous drifting mists. Well, now, this is obviously not true because I don't believe in that sort of stuff, you know. And it says that she has a pet spider named Rollo, and that can't be. And she hates, you know how people exaggerate. She hates the sunlight, and she's the ghostess with
Her look was inspired by the Addams Family cartoons by Charles Addams, with a glamorous and sexy spin. Vampira would go on to appear in Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space. In a similar spirit as Vampira, let's head to Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills to find another of television's early horror hosts, Ghoulardi. Created by Ernie Anderson, Ghoulardi was the host of Shock Theater, which featured B-horror and sci-fi films on Friday night television.
Hey, listen, gang! What do you think of the movie so far, huh? Hey, really bad.
Ghoulardi became immensely popular among the youth of the 60s, going on to host other shows like Laurel, Ghoulardi, and Hardy. A rare sight on this channel welcomes us to Lakeview Cemetery in Interlaken, New York, a snow-covered cemetery. Herein rests one of my personal heroes, Rod Serling. In 1959, he created and wrote for the iconic series The Twilight Zone, which features elements of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, with most episodes opening with a cameo by Serling, introducing the unusual events that were about to transpire
in the Twilight Zone.
So popular was the series, it would go on to spawn radio shows, films, and several reboots. Rod would follow this up with a more specifically horror-centric series, Night Gallery, which ran from 1969 to 1973. Rod was just 50 when he died from complications during heart surgery. For more from The Twilight Zone, be sure to check out our video homage, Hollywood Graveyard Enters the Twilight Zone. In the early 60s, there were two shows on television competing for the airtime of lovers of the spooky and the macabre with a comedic spin. The Addams Family and the Munsters, shows that ran only 2 seasons but still get airtime to this day. The only surviving cast member of the original Addams Family is John Astin, who played amorous patriarch Gomez Addams. The first actress to portray Morticia Addams on screen can be found in the mausoleum at Melrose Abbey Memorial Park in Anaheim. Here lies Carolyn Jones. She played Morticia in some 64 episodes of The Addams Family, which earned her a Golden Globe nomination.
I'll never forget my first night in this lovely house.
We thought it was haunted.
Well, you can't have everything.
Carolyn was no stranger to horror, also appearing in Invasion of the Body Snatchers and House of Wax with Vincent Price. Carolyn rests here alongside her mother. To find the man who played the hairless, barrel-shaped Uncle Fester on The Addams Family, we head to Holy Cross in Culver City. Here lies Jackie Coogan. He had been acting since the silent era, including alongside Charlie Chaplin in The Kid, when he was brought on to play the kooky Uncle Fester in 1964. You'll be curious to know that none of the Addams Family characters had names from the cartoons, and all the names you know, including Fester, were chosen for the 60s TV series.
I just had that done this morning.
Coogan would also voice Uncle Fester for the Addams Family cartoon series in the 70s. Living with the Addams Family is Gomez's mother, Grandmama. She's a witch who conjures spells and potions and dabbles in fortune-telling. Grandmama was played by Blossom Rock, who rests here in the Memory Slope section at Forest Lawn, Glendale.
Either you're out of practice or that ball needs repairing.
That scoundrel must have tampered with it.
Well, very well then. Get your own crystal ball.
The elder of the 2 Addams Family children, at least in the TV series, was a roly-poly boy named Pugsley. He was played by Ken Weatherwax, who rests in a niche here at Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood.
Oh, what's that, darling?
Harold's birthday present, a tarantula.
Oh, dear Pugsley, he's so generous.
Ken would reprise his role in the 1977 film Halloween with the new Addams Family. After his death at age 59, this niche was facilitated through efforts of his friend, Scott Michaels of Dearly Departed. The Addams Family. We recently lost the adorable girl in pigtails, the first actress to play Wednesday Addams, Lisa Loring, who died in 2023. She gave us the original Wednesday dance.
Come on, try it.
Lisa was cremated after her death, so there is no grave we can visit. The same with the actor who played Lurch, Ted Cassidy, who was cremated after his death in 1979.
You rang. Lurch, have you ever given thought to the blissful joys of marriage?
And what about that catchy, snappy tune, the Addams Family theme song? One I'll bet everyone out there could whistle. Do you know the man who gave us that tune? His name was Vic Mizzy, and he rests here at Eden Memorial Park in Mission Hills. He also wrote the catchy tune for Green Acres. His epitaph fittingly reads, "The whole world is singing my song." The other show competing for spooky airtime in the 60s was, you got it, The Munsters. The series was Universal's answer to the Addams Family, the Munsters being a family of monsters based off of the Universal monsters, Frankenstein's monster, vampires, a werewolf, etc. Unfortunately, there aren't as many Munsters' graves to visit as there are Addams Family, and the one we can visit is unmarked. This is Sandy Mount United Methodist Church Cemetery in Maryland, and this is the approximate location of the unmarked grave of Fred Gwynne. The tall comedic actor perfectly played the bumbling but lovable Herman Munster, the patriarch of the family and one of Frankenstein's monsters created in a lab in the 19th century.
The lesson I want you to learn is it doesn't matter what you look like. You can be tall or short, or fat or thin, or ugly, or handsome, like your father. It doesn't matter. What does matter is the size of your heart and the strength of your character.
Decades later, you would also see Fred in Pet Sematary.
Well, sometimes that is better.
Other members of the Munsters who have passed were cremated and have no grave to visit, including Yvonne De Carlo, who brilliantly played Lily Munster.
This ensemble has a cape made of tufted coffin lining in a lovely shade of cemetery green.
Beverly Owen, who was the first actress to play Marilyn, and the hilarious Al Lewis, who played Grandpa. Al was cremated after his death and his ashes placed into his favorite cigar box, a fact that was curiously foreshadowed on the show itself.
Oh, it's a box of cigars. And the box, you see, is a great place to keep your ashes.
Later that same decade came a new kind of horror experience on television. We're back at Eden Memorial Park and the grave of Dan Curtis. Dan was a television writer and producer who is best known for creating the gothic soap opera Dark Shadows, which ran for 6 seasons and a whopping 1,225 episodes between 1966 and 1971. It follows the lives of the Collins family, incorporating supernatural occurrences and characters like ghosts and vampires. It became popular amongst young audiences at that time and has since garnered a cult following. The popularity of the series spawned feature films, including the 2012 Tim Burton adaptation starring Johnny Depp as Barnabas Collins. Dan Curtis is also known to horror fans for producing other cult classics like the Night Stalker series, the Trilogy of Terror, and directing Burnt Offerings. The leading lady in Curtis's Trilogy of Terror would also become a cult horror icon. This brings us down to San Diego and Eternal Hills Memorial Park, where we find the grave of Karen Black. She played Julie, Millicent and Teresa, and Amelia in the 3-part horror anthology released in 1975. Curtis would bring her back again to star in the supernatural horror feature Burnt Offerings. She cemented herself as a horror icon starring in Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses in 2003.
Oh, he's a real lady killer.
For those looking to get their immersive horror kicks year-round at an amusement park, it's hard to beat the original Haunted Mansion at Disneyland, which opened in 1969. Many of Disney's most talented creatives worked on Haunted Mansion, like Mark Davis, Claude Coates, Rolly Crump, and Yale Gracie. Here at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, we find the man who combined all these elements into the script and storyline that became the Haunted Mansion. Here lies Xavier Atencio, also known as X Atencio. In addition to writing the script for Haunted Mansion, X also wrote the lyrics to its theme song, Grimm Grinning Ghosts. Xavier also worked on Pirates of the Caribbean and is the voice of the talking skull on the ride. And while waiting in line for the Haunted Mansion, be sure to look for the fake tombstone for Xavier Atencio in the graveyard. The man who wrote that spooky music for the Haunted Mansion, including the music to the song Grimm Grinning Ghosts, can be found here at Forest Lawn Hollywood. Here lies Buddy Baker, whose music for the Haunted Mansion sets the mood from the beginning with a chilling organ motif, gradually morphing into the fun graveyard romp with the Grimm Grinning Ghosts singing busts and dancing skeletons.
Grimm Grinning Ghosts come out to socialize.
The millions of annual visitors to Disneyland may not know the name of Leota Toombs, but they certainly know her face as the character of Madame Leota in the Haunted Mansion, also named for her.
It's time to respond. Send us a message from somewhere beyond.
Leota began her career at Disney in the ink and paint department and would eventually take her skills as a craftswoman to WED, working on attractions like Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion. They needed a model for the disembodied head of a gypsy woman in a crystal ball in the Haunted Mansion, and Leota was chosen for her exotic look, though the voice of Madame Leota was Eleanor Audley. But the voice you hear at the end of the ride, Little Leota, urging you to hurry back, is the actual voice of Leota Toombs, who rests here at Forest Lawn Glendale.
Hurry back. Be sure to bring your death certificate.
We're gradually making our way into the modern era, through the final decades of the 20th century into the 21st century. One of the most iconic horror films to usher in the 80s is one I'd wager most of you have seen. We're at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills once again to find the grave of Scatman Crothers. He played Dick Halloran alongside Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall in Stanley Kubrick's psychological horror film, The Shining. He's the one who explains the telepathic ability known as The Shining.
You know, Doc, when something happens, it can leave a trace of itself behind. Not things that anyone can notice, but things that people who shine can see.
Another of the memorable characters from The Shining is laid to rest here at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Joe Turkel played Lloyd, the ghostly bartender in The Shining.
Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Mr. Torrance. What'll it be?
You also saw Joe in films like Blade Runner and The Killing. He passed away in 2022 at the age of 94. As of filming, his crypt features just a temporary marker. And just a few months ago, we lost Scatman Crothers and Joe Turkel's co-star in The Shining, Shelley Duvall, who was reportedly laid to rest back in Texas.
Here's Johnny!
2 years later came the first in a series of popular 80s ghost stories, Poltergeist, which was nominated for 3 Oscars. It's the story of a suburban family whose home is invaded by malevolent ghosts who abduct their youngest daughter. That daughter, Carol Ann, was played by Heather O'Rourke, who rests in this crypt at Westwood Village Memorial Park.
They're here.
Heather would reprise her role as Carol Ann in the film's 2 sequels. Tragically, though, young Heather fell ill during the filming of the 3rd movie. In 1988, she began experiencing flu-like symptoms. She was rushed to the hospital suffering cardiac arrest. It was discovered she had an intestinal stenosis. Emergency surgery was performed, but she suffered another cardiac arrest. Doctors were unable to save her. She was just 12. Poltergeist 3 is dedicated to Heather. Turning our eyes to the south in the lawn in this same cemetery, not far from Heather, we find the grave of her co-star, Dominique Dunne. She played elder sister Dana in Poltergeist. Like her co-star Heather, Dominique would also die tragically young, not due to illness, but at the hand of her boyfriend. Just months after Poltergeist was released, during an argument with her boyfriend, Dana was strangled to death. She was just 22. Her killer was convicted only of manslaughter, serving just 3 years, leading to outrage in the community. The tragic and untimely deaths of the 2 young starlets in Poltergeist gave rise to the notion of a poltergeist curse. The 1980s ushered in the era of the slasher genre. In New York's Calvary Cemetery, we find a character actor who would become something of a cult icon of early slasher films, Joe Spinell. Mainstream audiences remember him as the tough loan shark with a soft spot in his heart for Rocky Balboa. But fans of slasher movies remember him as the title character in 1980's Maniac.
Maniac. It will tear the life out of you.
He would follow this up with the horror comedy The Last Horror Film and The Undertaker, released in 1988. Joe died after accidentally cutting himself on broken shower door glass and bleeding out. The 80s also gave us iconic slasher franchises like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street. If you're a fan of Freddy Krueger, you know the name Wes Craven. a master of horror who rests here at Lambert's Cove Cemetery in Massachusetts. In 1984, he made A Nightmare on Elm Street, which introduced the world to Freddy Krueger, who murders his victims in their dreams.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Do you believe in the boogeyman?
No.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
The franchise would go on to include 9 films, a TV series, novels, comic books, and more, making it one of the most successful horror franchises in history. In the 90s, Wes would direct the first 4 films of another iconic franchise, the Scream franchise. And let's not forget other films like The Hills Have Eyes, Swamp Thing, and The People Under the Stairs. We owe a lot of childhood screams to Wes Craven. Comedy and horror make strange but wonderful bedfellows, don't they? The same year that A Nightmare on Elm Street came out, we got our first glimpse into the comedic world of the Ghostbusters. What a magical decade the 80s was, am I right? This is Shalom Memorial Park in Illinois, where Harold Ramis is laid to rest. Ramis played Dr. Egon Spangler, the awkward and perhaps most scientifically minded of the 4 Ghostbusters. Ramis would also co-write the script.
Well, let's say this Twinkie represents the normal amount of psychokinetic energy in the New York area. According to this morning's sample, it would be a Twinkie 35 feet long, weighing approximately 600 pounds.
That's a big Twinkie.
He would reprise his role in the sequel, and voiced Egon in the video games as well. Harold Ramis died in 2014, and his death was addressed in the modern sequels. Egon's ghost appears in Ghostbusters Afterlife, years after the death of Harold Ramis. Speaking of horror comedies, after the success of the Addams Family television show, that kooky family made their way to film in 1991 with a new cast. Raul Julia perfectly played the amorous Gomez Addams in the 1991 film adaptation and its 1993 sequel, Addams Family Values.
An open grave. It was my first funeral.
You were so beautiful, pale and mysterious. No one even looked at the corpse.
Raul also played Victor Frankenstein in Roger Corman's 1990 film, Frankenstein Unbound. He was just 54 when he died from complications of a stroke after battling cancer. He rests here at Buxeda Memorial Park in Puerto Rico. The modern era has given us many notable writers who have added to the landscape of horror in literature, like Stephen King, as well as the prolific author who is entombed here at Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans, Anne Rice. She is perhaps the most famous author of Gothic fiction of her generation. Her notable works include The Vampire Chronicles, Lives of the Mayfair Witches, and Exit to Eden. Her work has been adapted on screen numerous times, including Interview with the Vampire in 1994. 2002's Queen of the Damned was also based on The Vampire Chronicles. The TV series Mayfair Witches was also recently produced on AMC, as well as the new Interview with the Vampire series. Her books have sold over 100 million copies, making her one of the modern era's best-selling authors. She died from complications of a stroke in 2021 at age 80. One of the most successful horror television franchises of the modern era, and the most successful zombie franchise since Romero's Night of the Living Dead series, is AMC's The Walking Dead. It's an adaptation of the comic book series of the same name, set in a post-apocalyptic world beset by reanimated corpses of the dead. In the second season, we were introduced to patriarch, farmer, veterinarian, and sage Herschel Green. He was played by Scott Wilson, who rests here at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills.
Now, I can make these people feel better and hang on a little bit longer. I can save lives. That's reason enough to risk mine.
Scott would appear in some 38 episodes of the series. Decades earlier, you saw Scott Wilson in Truman Capote's crime drama In Cold Blood as Dick. One of the most successful horror franchises of the modern era began with a short film in 2003 called Saw, which was used to pitch the idea of a feature film to studios. Australian filmmakers James Wan and Lee Wangenheim showed the short film to producer Greg Hoffman here in Los Angeles. It was Hoffman who greenlit the production of the first Saw film, later forming Twisted Pictures with his partners Mark Berg and Oren Kools to produce Saw and other indie horror films.
I want to play a game. Live or die. Make your choice.
The success of the film launched a media franchise including 10 films, video games, and even a roller coaster. Saw 3 was in production at the time of Hoffman's death at the age of 42, of what was cited as natural causes. He rests here at Mount Sinai in Los Angeles. Our last stop of the day takes us to Stepney Cemetery in Connecticut. Here we find the grave of Ed and Lorraine Warren. They were paranormal investigators and writers who were associated with prominent cases of alleged haunting. Ed was a demonologist and Lorraine a clairvoyant. They investigated numerous prominent paranormal phenomena and hauntings, including the Amityville haunting. They would be consultants in the Amityville horror films. In 2013, the world would be introduced to Ed and Lorraine Warren in the form of The Conjuring, a film about their work, in which they were portrayed by Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson.
Well, we've been called demonologists. It's one name for us. Ghost hunters, paranormal researchers.
Kooks.
Wackos.
But we prefer to be known simply as Ed and Lorraine Warren.
This would spawn a new horror franchise and shared universe of films in the coming years. The Conjuring universe, based off of their real-life paranormal investigations, has become the most successful horror franchise in movie history. As we wrap up our tour, I should note that this is obviously just a small fraction of the countless men and women who have made a mark on horror over the years. As alluded to a few times today, there are a lot of legends of horror who have no grave we can visit for one reason or another. Just a few of them are listed here. Who else would you add to this list of horror icons? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more famous grave tours. Thanks for watching, and stay spooky, my friends.